So our next session is AI and post-human futures. Now, not only are we fortunate enough to have two Barrys in the room, but two Barrys as moderators. So Barry Stephenson is going to come.
It's a special day.
I feel #blessed.
Okay, well, thanks for that. First up, we have David Newman. What can I say about David?
All kinds of things I can say.
Well, I'll say this. Writing, speaking, theology, culture, science, nature, the ocean, astronomy, imagination, photography, and sport. Dave is a graduate of MUN, right? You're currently at Acadia. You're adjunct here at Queen's.
Apparently so.
So I've heard, and you're working on your doctorate.
I submitted my thesis in July. They haven't got back to me.
Nice.
Uh-oh.
So Dave's paper is titled "The Holy Ghost in the Machine." So Dave.
Thank you, Barry. Well, thanks to Queen's College, these friends of mine, the Religious Studies Department, for organizing the symposium. Thank you for the wonderful lecture last night, Sir Jack. So you put in that order. Your lovely wife, and also to have Barry here, sir. It's a pleasure to have you in Newfoundland. I'm going to couch this presentation in my context. For many years, I was a Pentecostal minister. I share that distinction with different people, serving in rural ed poor communities and here in St. John's. Like Robert, I'm from Notre Dame Bay, the old French shore. It's pronounced Notre Dame Bay. I used to vote when I was a child. I used to root for the Notre Dame Fighting Irish for no other reason that I was from Notre Dame Bay. I found that out later. Now, I'm from Lewisport, which makes me, the tag's not great, Lewisportonians or something. Not half as interesting as Robert's tag. He's from Leading Ticklers, which makes him a leading tickler. Which sounds kind of promiscuous to me, but that's all right. Let me offer you three images from kind of, I guess, a visual imagery, evocative imagery, maybe, of a Pentecostal minister on Outport. I can bring you to like an evening service in a small village where at the time there wasn't a lot to do on a Sunday night other than go to your local church of sorts. And you'd have people gathered around there and they would be very passionate about what's happening. So after a sermon of varying lengths, different breaks I would have in between, you would often have people, they would be invited. I don't know what your background is, religious and denominationally, but you'd be invited to the front, to the altar area, they would call it. And then people engage in revivalism, and I mean, and if the heat was on, if the fire was in the fireplace or in the potbelly stove, and you have people of multiple generations, and the emotion and the focus as they were singing, and hands raised, hands laid upon each other. People could be very quiet. Some people could be dancing, which you weren't allowed to do unless it was in the spirit. If it was in the skin, that was another issue altogether. And you would find yourself awash in this mystical presence of the Spirit. I've had these experiences before and quite remarkable and lovely. I also know what it's like after everybody's left and you're turning off the lights and it's a kind of fall sort of night. And I remember in Bay Roberts, and you'd walk out, and on occasion, and some of you would know this if you're from a maritime part of the world, you'd walk out and it was almost as if the ocean had filled up the sky. The sweet and the salty smell of the ocean, you were actually breathing it in, as if the sea and the sky and the land all kind of mixed together. You have to get your sea legs ready as you walked out. Wouldn't be surprising if a codfish just swam in front of you in the middle of the night. And again, it was so rich in the presence and the atmosphere. I guess if I got bring creator into this, into the whole idea of the spirit of creation. I also know what it's like to get home after everyone else was asleep, to think about my sermon and what I said, and wondered, oh my, they're going to ask me to leave. To go out and look through the kitchen window into the night, into the darkness, and hope to goodness that what I said was accurate, that God is real, and that there is some sort of future for me. Maybe even if the breath that's on the window on this side, I know is mine, is there a breath on the other side of the glass? This is a little bit of imagery from where it is. So, where is the Spirit? Is the Spirit in a passionate dance of ecstatics in my particular type of religious experience? Is it where the sea and the sky and the land meet and you suddenly are lost in what creation is? Or is it when you wonder if God is real and who you are? Could the Spirit actually be the Spirit in a question of whether the Spirit is real? Inspectors of God, an anatomy of the apophatic imagination, a gentleman by the name of Jack Caputo, engages in God far from the charismatic dance floor, or even the natural beauty of an outport, though it is beautiful language. And in reading about this gentleman's biography and history, and in a couple of symposiums he has done and interviews with evangelical sorts of mind, he certainly has an affinity and appreciation. But I wonder if the spiritual seeking experience is somewhat akin to me looking at that window and seeing my breath and all the experiences I've had and not wiping them out because at the least they're human. I'm wondering if there's a breath on the other side. Is your idea of the Spirit speaking in tongues or singing in tongues? Is your idea of the Spirit that walk in the woods, or is your idea of the Spirit a very heavy theological, philosophic, a very personal conversation you may have with yourself? I think it's time for a Caputonian pneumatology. Fine pneumatology at that. And I've made myself available to numerous publishers, but at this point, Archie's Digest comics have not gotten back to me. In Caputo's Anxious Apophatics, he says the spectrality of God will mean that God has become a Holy Ghost of the past, the apophatic imagination. And it can be, at times, a tad apocalyptic, at least to the eschatologically sensitive like myself. He says, ever groping for the ungraspable will move on to the unimaginable immensity of the universe itself, including the spooky thought that it all ends in naught. Hal Lindsey, the dispensationalist, has never put together something so dark as that statement there says. You could very well have a future in this type of evangelism, including the spooky thought that it all ends in naught. But I suppose it's perspective again. You're looking at the glass through the window. It's also a bit of a, forgive me for this, a bit of a murder-suicide. The third person of the Trinity guiding the epitaph of the death of God before dying herself. Because the death of God is possibly one of the most significant philosophical and theological propositions which a lot of contemporary theology is built upon, but certainly I think radical theology. Again, as somebody who attended a Pentecostal Bible college, and if you're wondering, it was called Eastern Pentecostal Bible College in Peterborough. One of our graduates was Jesus. I don't remember learning a whole lot about the death of God other than at Easter. And I'm fairly certain it was followed by something called the resurrection. And yet some of this that I found myself going down the well of thought in is amazing and wonderful, imaginative, and even poetic. Being introduced to a chap by the name of Altizer, who was certain about the death of God that was actually the death of God. Philosophic death of God, but maybe actual death of God. Another chap by the name of Taylor, don't you come across him in the neologism, a theology, looking into the empty mirror I mean, that's as depth, that's as dark and as deep and as symbolic as Harry Potter looking for his parents. What about Winquist? Rather interesting character, his biography, the epiphany of darkness. I believe that's what my wife called our marriage after a number of years. There's lots of other wonderful people, and they certainly have a coinage for language, as does this gentleman here. Wonderful things like cosmos and spectre and vanity, the language of Derrida. By the way, sir, I'm not sure if you're familiar with, there are a variety of songs which speak of specters and ghosts. One of my favorite classical pieces by Justin Bieber, that if I can't be close to you, I'll settle for the ghost of you. Maybe more familiar with 1984 Ray Parker, Ghostbusters, that there's something strange in the neighborhood. Who are you going to call? Jack Caputo. Dare I go back to 1955, Jay Livingston, Ray Evans, Doris Day sang Que Sera, Sera. Do you remember that song?
I do.
The original was Que Sera, Derrida. Whatever it means.
Derrida.
Let me speak briefly about the Imago Dei and the death of God. To imagine that humanity was created in the image of God, I think I'll use a very natural thing. Those of you who are Star Trek fans, I remember the statement that the doctor said back to Spock, that it was the most natural thing in the world for us to create God in our image. And so it would work back, as if it were, into a previous generation of sentience, humanity thinking back to God. So in that sense, we're kind of second generation sentient. But then the other direction, in thinking about the death of God, I have just recently, and I'm not making light of this, just lost my mom about a year ago. And the losing of that generation is a very difficult thing. I can't imagine for people of faith, as they were working through philosophy and things, that was much of a joyous occasion to lose something so significant as your belief in the divine, and the rupture that causes, and the theological things that arise from it. Well, when we speak of AI, when we speak of the idea of sentience of some sorts of a created technological third generation, wonder about what it's like for when you first see that humanoid begin to demonstrates patterns of its previous generation. And when these sentient beings begin to have multiple generations themselves, and when you read the narratives, when you watch movies of how these robots will take over everything, I wonder what it will be when the robots finally kill us all. And then they're the third generation. And will there be some theological robot out there by the name of Jack Caputo 2.0 that will begin wondering about the possibility that those humans were real after all? I'm not sure if you're familiar with the phrase ghost in the machine. It was inspired negatively by René Descartes. His discourse on the method, help me with the Latin, my friend, cogito ergo sum. Thank you. Basically, properly translated, I think, therefore I am. For some, they would say that's one of the beginnings of modernity. The idea of being able to step back and look at yourself and non-biased, be able to think things through. What a great thing. Anyways, that held its way, and it was very influential for a long period of time. But eventually, people like Gilbert Ryle, his neologism was the ghost in the machine. He was an Oxford metaphysics gentleman. And he spoke at Descartes, and they said, no, this idea, this duality of mind and body, that doesn't really work. So he used the phrase, the whole idea, he was from almost a mocking statement, as I understand it. He says, Descartes going around with his ghost in his machine, and they're able to dialogue back and forth. And he mocked it. Later on, different people came up with other terms. Daniel Dennett, 1991, his phrase is now quite used, the Cartesian theater. I don't know if you've ever heard that. We have down here the LSP Hall, where you can watch Newfoundland productions. Go to the Cartesian theater, put yourself on stage, and watch yourself. And see what happens. So it's kind of moved into lingua franca, language. But eventually you had a kind of movement with Ghost and the Machine, which kind of strays away from that criticism. And it was about the idea of the sentience, a human sentience or some sort of sentience in a machine, and understanding itself to somehow be alive and separate and go through some of those characteristics that we heard about today in variations of time. A fellow named Kessler. I enjoyed him. I didn't realize he was into this. Arthur Kessler. I was first introduced him to a book called Darkness at Noon in the 1940s. A Hungarian gentleman during communism. He was a communist early, but he wrote this dark book about what it was like, I think, to be locked away at noon. It was introspection. He wrote a book called The Ghost in the Machine. He put the definitive article "the" in front of it. And he described things. He came up with a concept called Halon, moved around with different ideas. And he agreed again with this critique that you could not have this duality. But what will it be, I wonder, for a machine to eventually, some of you said unequivocally, well, a machine can't have sentience. But as a theist, as someone's part of that tradition anyways, maybe you are. I'm not sure if it should be difficult to imagine the idea of a machine having sentience. In fact, if you're not a theist, and you're somebody that believes went through some other sort of system, and there is no God beyond that, how in the world did this second generation of sentience, or first generation sentience, get the sentience in the first place? So this third generation of artificial intelligence, maybe one day it will. We as human beings, whether we imagine the spirit, whether we engage the spirit, or whether we just rejoice in the spirit's creation, or whether we stare at the window, wondering if any of it is actually real. We get lost in the possibilities and the theories of the matrix of religion. This is what it is to be human. And maybe one day, another generation will follow. And they will say, well, this is what it is to be AI. I don't think I'll be around for them. I think I will fall prey to Caputo's apocalyptic end of it all. But if I don't, I know that I will be picking up his latest copy of this book, which, if you haven't already, what should you believe in? It's in bookstores everywhere. May I close with this thought? I enjoy theology. I enjoy personal application of theology. But as this is something's being inspired by your work, I'd like to honor you, sir, with these folk. Because even as a theist, even as somebody that has a Pentecostal background and all that interesting thing, good writing, good ideas, honorable people, compassionate folk, generous people like yourselves, shine the brightest lights on anyone that just takes a moment to look and to listen. And I thank you all for coming. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, David. Sean is back. That's good. Sean McGrath is a friend or a colleague or a teacher or a mentor or all of the above to, I think, many of us here. So, yeah, you know, he is professor of philosophy at Memorial University. Stuck in the days of drudgery, continuing to teach German idealism. We know where his true heart lies, and we'll see if we can steer it in the correct direction. Sean's paper today is titled AI and Human Difference. So, Sean, please.
It's a pretty academic paper. It's a bit of a drudgery. My grandfather said, never apologize for your cooking, but I guess I just did. But thanks for the opportunity, and thanks for the invitation, and Jack Kudo for being here, and other guests. students who come out. So just as a little heads up on what this is all about. The distinction between artificial general intelligence and artificial intelligence, or artificial narrow intelligence, which is what we have now, is at the heart of this paper. And I want to pick up on a play on words that came up in yesterday's discussion. If artificial general intelligence is the artifice that is intelligent, which doesn't yet exist and may never, artificial intelligence is artificial intelligence. It's fake intelligence. Just like artificial sweetener is not sugar. It does some of the things that sugar does, but other things it doesn't do. And in the same way, the intelligence that exists now, in which we are largely, we're becoming more and more dependent on, is this latter kind. It is artificial intelligence. And so the great question is, can it become something more than that? And so some of the inspirations in this work are as follows. The discussion about artificial intelligence from the 70s. So this is a thing that's going to be debated in philosophy for a while, particularly the issue of functionalism. And some of you will know the famous Chinese room experiment. Briefly, it's just this. John Searle wrote this thought experiment long before we had ChatGPT, when he was discussing what exactly, an artificial intelligence would be and why it would be not, a rational intelligence. So you imagine somebody who doesn't speak Chinese in a closed room being fed slips of paper under the door in Chinese, and he has a rule book that tells him how to respond to those Chinese symbols that are being slipped to him through the door with other Chinese symbols. And after a bit of practice, he could be functionally interacting with Chinese speakers on the outside without himself understanding a single word of Chinese. So that's called functionalism. That is, he functions like a Chinese speaker, but he isn't actually a Chinese speaker. And the question is, well, is there anything more required to be a Chinese speaker than to function as a Chinese speaker? That's behind the Turing thing as well, right? If it functions like a human being, well, what else is there? The other inspiration is David Chalmers and the hard problem of consciousness, his zombie experiment. So if the mind is nothing but the brain, we're probably okay. We can figure out that the brain is kind of like a neural network, and our computers are becoming more like that, and the problem is solved. If the mind is nothing but the brain, but if the mind is something other than the brain, or different than the brain, dependent upon the brain, but has its own kind of, what shall we say, patterns of operation, then we're in trouble. And so he has this zombie experiment where he says, well, we shouldn't be able to, if the mind is nothing but the brain, we should not be able to imagine a brain functioning without a mind. Because for the brain to function, it's for the mind to function. The mind is nothing but the brain. But we can imagine brains functioning without the mind. They're called zombies. Therefore, there must be something more in mind than brain. And then the other classic text is Searle's essay, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? What is it like to be a bat? Now, that's the whole point there is that what is it like? In other words, there's something to an experience which really can't be communicated, but can only be experienced. There's something to being a bat that only a bat knows about. What is this thing? And sometimes called qualia, So these are some of the things that were in my mind as I put this together a couple of years ago. Now, my simple thesis is very simple. And as I get older, if things I have to say become simpler and simpler and more banal, maybe. But nevertheless, I feel compelled to say it. The simple thesis is this, that rational intelligence, whether it's artificial or natural, rational intelligence judges. And we will not have achieved artificial general intelligence until we have produced a machine that rationally judges. And to judge is not to apply a rule, but to respond volitionally to a phenomena, to an insight, if you like. Some of my inspirations, further footnote on that is Cassira, Ernst Cassira, Bernard Lonergan, Edward Husserl, and Thomas Nagel, particularly in his book, Mind and Cosmos. This paper came out of a 2-year working project with some German colleagues on intelligence. It was called the Working Group on Intelligence, and we distinguished natural intelligence from human intelligence, because who's to say we're the only intelligent beings, organic beings, since there's plenty of intelligence out in nature and non-human nature. So natural intelligence, human intelligence, and artificial intelligence. We had a meeting in Ladenburg, Germany, right as the pandemic was hitting in March 2020. And then we continued online until recently. We just cleared it up. And in fact, right now, Josh Hook, who's in the audience, is editing the proceedings of that. And this paper is basically the paper that came out of that. So we've been thinking and talking about this for a while, and I've certainly learned a lot from my colleagues on this. What's at issue in the question concerning artificial general intelligence? Because I take it to be that's where all the action is. Certainly in the talk last night. An ambiguity pervades the current discussion about artificial general intelligence. Yeah, artificial general intelligence, not just the machine that can do something better than we do it, because we have plenty of such machines. You have one in your pocket. Artificial narrow intelligence is given a task and it does it exponentially better than a human being can do it, whether it's translating or finding a restaurant. But an artificial general intelligence would be able to do any task a human being does better. And in particular, one thing that humans do really well, which is invent tools. So it would be productive of its own capacities, as we have been in our evolution. That would be artificial general intelligence. And there's an ambiguity in the discussion about whether it's possible or not. It's an ambiguity about the aim of the project from the beginning. The ambiguity is this: are we seeking to design a machine that can do all that we do and more, better than we do it, however it does it, any old way? Or are we seeking to design a machine that does what we do in the way we do it, i.e. a machine that is not only empirically conscious, cognitively responsive to sense data, but also intelligently and rationally conscious? They're not the same goals. Quite possibly we'll pull off a machine that does everything we do better than we do it, but not in the way we do it. But it's this how we do things that intrigues me. And it's far from settled that we understand how we do those things that are so distinctively us. And this is what's so exciting about the debate, is it's causing us to open up questions that really are well worth opening up. It's this other alternative, though, a machine that can do everything we do in the way we do it, that's of most interest. This so-called singularity will not be brought about because of the efficiency of our machines and organizing the ends we set for them, but because of the capacity of our machines to set ends we have not decided upon. Not only machine learning acquiring the capacity for intentional thought, which we share with the higher animals, but above all, acquiring the capacity for judgment and decision. You know, that's when we feed in solve climate change and it exterminates humanity. So in a recent article, Ragnar Feiland, 2020, has looked at the evidence in support of the widespread claim of some computer engineers that we are only decades away from artificial general intelligence. He concluded that it was exaggerated. Neither algorithmic AI, the brain behind Amazon, YouTube, and countless other consumer service providers, nor more recent advances in creating artificial neural networks or even large language learning models have come close to the promises of AGI, artificial general intelligence. Rather, we're producing variations on artificial narrow intelligence, machines that can achieve amazing feats, such as Deep Blue, which beat the world chess champion Garry Kasparov in 1997, or AlphaGo, which defeated the world Go champion Lei Sedol in 2016, because they were programmed to do nothing else. But humans are good at many things. In fact, imagine a human programmed to do only one thing. That would be totally inhuman. It would not be human. So specialization, as anyone who has persisted through a PhD program knows, is a limiting and constraining of natural human intelligence. So Freyland concludes, quote, the overestimation of technology is closely connected with the underestimation of humans. What AGI researchers are running up against is the natural ability of ordinary humans to do many things more or less well, even though they cannot explain how it is they do them. And on the basis of this limited and unthematized knowledge, their related ability to understand people very different from themselves and to continue learning. This requires the tacit knowledge Michael Polanyi defined as that human ability to learn something complicated from other humans, like swimming or riding a bicycle, without having the faintest idea of actually how one does it. You can teach another human being to do something that you don't really understand how you do yourself. Tacit knowledge Phelan now argues has to do with being embodied and inhabiting a world. He concludes that, quote, Herbert Dreyfus's arguments against general AI are still valid, end quote, even some 50 years later. This is because so-called general intelligence depends upon being in the world, in Heidegger's sense of the term world. This is the argument. The referential totality, which is never an object of knowledge or concern, but the horizon of all concerns, plans, and tool usages, and knowable objects. Only the existential embodiment, the argument goes, the enculturation and historicity characteristic of Dasein, the mode of being unique to the human being, only this grants one the capacity to perform the countless tasks and to quickly learn countless others, which we take for granted in ordinary life. So that was Herbert Dreyfus's argument for why computers can't think. I would like to speak in this paper, though, about a different feature of human being that continues to elude AI researchers and which is underappreciated in the Heideggerian account: rationality. Heidegger is involved in a not so subtle polemic with the whole Western tradition on its ostensibly privileging of the theoretical attitude over practical life, the rational attitude over practical living. This is not at all irrelevant to the question of the nature of human intelligence, of course, as Dreyfus had made plain. But here I do not want to bypass human theoretical or objective knowing or cognition, but rather to focus on it for a moment. Human cognition, I take to be expressed not in the rule following or in the exhaustive mapping of probabilities, which computers already exceed us at, but in judgments of facts and decisions about what ought to be done in a particular situation. A first obstacle to be removed in the discussion about whether or not AGI, in the strong sense of reduplicating human intelligence, is possible, is a persistent, impoverished understanding of what we are doing when we know anything at all. So, little bit on reductionism that I shall skip there. In the early days of the AI debate, philosophers such as John Searle among the analysts and Dreyfus among the continentalists tried to show the fallacy involved in the assumption that reproducing and improving on the human capacity to manage information would also reproduce human consciousness. While much has happened in computer science since then, not so much, it seems, has happened in the philosophy of mind. Marcus Gabriel is busy popularizing neglected arguments culled from the dusty tomes of German idealists to refute the new materialists. He has good reason to do so. Nothing was more evident to Fichte, Schelling, and Hegel than the irreducibility of mind to its material conditions of operation. David Chalmers' much discussed zombie argument repeats in some ways Searle's Chinese room experiment of the 80s, a functionalist account of the human difference, which presumes that a machine that passes the Turing test because it acts and responds to questions as humans act and respond, leaves out the very thing in need of explanation, the hard problem of consciousness. The question, why is there subjective experience in the first place? If the computer doesn't need it, why do you need it? What's it good for? Or does it exist? The question raised by Dreyfus, Nagel, and Searle in the 70s and 80s was the following. Is a human intelligence essentially an information processor? If it is, then we have already been supplanted. My cell phone is a much more efficient processor than my brain. So the game is up. But if human intelligence is not an information processor, then we need to reopen the question of how to best characterize it. This is the essential question that must still be addressed as we move forward into the era of machine learning. Unlike any good question, it can be broken down into smaller questions. For example, information processing requires the manipulation of signs. At the basic level, every piece of data in a computer can be expressed as some combination of two signs, 0 and 1. But are there other ways of using signs, perhaps more distinctively human, which are not primarily manipulative and pragmatic? Do all animals use signs as stand-ins for their objects over which they seek control? Or do some animals, human animals, most notably, not also use signs not only or even primarily as indexicals pointing to stuff, but to facilitate practical activity, not only to facilitate practical activity, but also to use signs as symbols in a stricter sense of the term, as mediators of meaning? So there follows a great discussion there about sign and symbol, which I will skip for the sake of time. And move right to the business at hand today. Symbolic thinking as freedom. I got this one to skip. Excuse me. Yeah, all kinds of fascinating things here. Look, here's the lion hand from 30,000 years ago. Can't talk about that. Cave art, no, not talking about that. It's just a promise. You can read it if you want later. Here's what I want to talk about. Revisiting the argument against functionalism. The capacity for symbolically mediated objectivity has been repeatedly invoked by philosophers of mind to refute the so-called functionalist argument. Rooted in Alan Turing's test of the same name, which was designed to prove the indiscernibility of a sufficiently sophisticated mechanical response to a question from a human response, and also designed to refute the late Wittgenstein's behaviorism, the functionalist argument holds that for a machine to be considered intelligent, it is enough for it to respond and act in the same outwardly observable fashion that a human being responds. The counter argument holds that a generally intelligent machine would need to not only do what humans do, but also do it in the way humans do it. It would need to act for reasons. Its acts would be outcomes of judgments and decisions, the result of a process, which is oriented to, we could say, structures of intelligibility that are not reducible to our thinking about them. For example, one can memorize mathematical formulae without understanding them. That's how we all started our sums, right? Repeating them. We all know that is not what it means to do math. And when one thereby solves math problems, one acts in the same way that a machine responds to input on a keyboard. The machine does not understand that 2 + 2 = 4. It responds to the input in the way it is determined to respond. An elephant can be trained to use a paintbrush and produce abstract pictures that can be sold for a good price on the art market. But no one seriously believes that the elephant is making art for the same reasons that humans make art. Rational consciousness appears to require more than the capacity to respond to stimuli. It appears to be more than a mechanical reaction. It judges states of affairs. And whenever it does so correctly, it reaches beyond the circumstances and the practical need of the judger. To judge rationally, whether of a matter of fact or of concern, is to transcend need and circumstances and rule following and affirm or deny the truth of what is at issue. How exactly humans do this and why they should have evolved in such a way as to be able to do it is the theme of Thomas Nagel's Mind and Cosmos, which I highly recommend to you as an extraordinary book, taking on neo-Darwinian materialism, not in the interest of religion, but in the interest of an adequate philosophy of mind. His thesis is that mind could never have evolved in the way that the neo-Darwinian materialists believe evolution occurred. According to Nagel, a reductionist theory of evolution, which would explain mind in terms of the evolution of material processes, and so all animal behavior in terms of naturally selected advantages, competing, this cannot make sense of rational judgment. One way the reductionist deals with this problem is by denying the existence of mind altogether. There is no such thing. Nagel notes that the denial of the existence of mind states was the strategy of 20th century behaviorist philosophers such as Ryle and Wittgenstein. The problem with their arguments, according to Nagel, is that they leave out exactly that which is to be explained. The first-person experience of being a mind. What is it like to be conscious of something, quote, the way sugar tastes to you, or the way red looks, or anger feels, each of which seems to be something more than the behavioral responses and discriminatory capacities that these experiences explain. Assuming that denying the existence of mental states and reducing understanding to rule following is not an adequate strategy for addressing the hard problem of consciousness, Nagel concludes, quote, that conscious subjects and their mental lives are inescapable components of reality, not describable by the physical sciences, end quote. It's such a good quote, I read it again. Conscious subjects and their mental lives are inescapable components of reality that are not describable by the physical sciences. Along a similar line of argumentation, mental states cannot be held to be identical to the brain states that underlie them. It is conceivable that there could be a brain without any mental states, as in Chalmers' zombie argument. Therefore, if there is something called a mental state, it's not identical to a state of the brain or any other material configuration for that matter. For example, the circuitry of a computer. As such, it cannot be explained as only a product of material evolution. Nagel's main argument, going in exactly the opposite direction of Dreyfus's defense of the human difference on the basis of care, Nagel's argument zeroes in on the objectivity of judgment. This is a nice return to early phenomenology there for Josh. Whether epistemic judgments concerning an objective state of affairs or moral judgments concerning right and wrong. Along the materialist, neo-Darwinian line, he notes, a judgment can be nothing more than a strategic, self-interested move by an organism trying to get one up on its competitors. If this were true, if every judgment was just a strategic move of getting one up on your competitors, then the history of science and human morality, indeed all our cultural achievements, from ancient religion to quantum physics and modern art, would be explicable as naturally selected products of evolution. The capacity for science and art would only have developed in us because they gave us an evolutionary advantage. There would therefore be no sense in speaking about objectivity or truth then or now, for evolutionary determinism is still driving our minds. As the most recently randomly selected bundle of animal attributes, we contemporary humans only call something true or false because it's in our interest to so call it. But this would mean that the theory of evolution itself is held to be true, not because it offers us the more coherent and adequate account of the facts or of geological time, but because it's in our interest to affirm it as true. We call evolution true because it's in our interest. Should creationism prove more advantageous, and for a sizable minority, the jury's still out on this, then creationism shall be justified as true over evolution. A theory, you can see the point here, is not in our interest because it corresponds to the fact, but because thinking it so gets us one up on the other. Plainly, however, the intention of the scientist who insists on the truth of evolution against his objector, for example, Richard Dawkins debating Rowan Williams at the University of Oxford in 2012, the intention is not to advance his thesis because he believes it to be more advantageous to believe it, although he might also think that, but because he believes it to be true, and he believes the other side to be false. For reasons such as this, Nagel argues that any theory of evolution which purports to explain the mental in terms of the physical and to reduce the human difference to a naturally selected evolutionary advantage commits the functionalist fallacy. It collapses the reasons for judgment into the outwardly performed act of judging. We no doubt develop the capacity to reason in the course of evolution, but reason itself is not a mere expression of natural self-interest. Quote from Nagel, merely to identify a cause is not to provide a significant explanation without some understanding of why the cause produces the effect, end quote. Of most interest for the purposes of this paper is Nagel's distinction between consciousness and reason. Consciousness in its simplest form might be merely sophisticated stimulus response, and so explicable as having evolved because of the natural advantage it gives certain kinds of life over others. But rational intelligence, that's judging intelligence, does not merely self-interestedly react, rather it disinterestedly responds to objective truth and value. Indeed, the affirmation of a truth is often not in our interest as egos or as groups, as psychoanalysts have been pointing out for a century. One could, by extension, imagine that some truths are not in our interest as species. The capacity to intelligently respond to truth with a reasoned judgment about the state of affairs, regardless of what the judger would prefer to believe, cannot be solely determined by evolutionary advantage. Here's another quote from Nagel. Thought and reasoning are correct or incorrect in virtue of something independent of the thinker's beliefs, and even independent of the community of thinkers to which he belongs. Now, Nagel's hardly the first to draw the distinction between consciousness and reason. It can be traced back to Aristotle, and in its Aristotelian registers had been developed by Lonergan as the difference between empirical intelligent consciousness. Nor is Nagel the first to use the distinction to refute a reductionist materialist account of mind. Few remember, besides from Josh, that Husserl's phenomenology originated in a debate with what was then called psychologism, the reductionist argument emerging out of late 19th century positivism that judgments are nothing more than the effect of certain psychological conditions or events, just neural hardwiring, right? Psychologism for Husserl amounted to a denial of the validity of logic. Logic must be more than a psychological condition determining how we should judge. It's not a rule book that we follow. Husserl insisted that the validity or invalidity of a judgment must be logically independent of the judgment if it's a real judgment. Quote from Husserl, Logical Investigations, logical laws taken in and for themselves are not normative propositions at all in the sense of prescriptions, i.e. propositions which tell us as part of their content how one should judge. You don't follow logical rules the way you follow the rules of the road. Inspired by Husserl's argument, and especially that of Husserl's star student Emil Lask, Heidegger wrote his doctoral dissertation defending logic against psychologism. For Heidegger, the undeniable and overruling sense of logical validity is a phenomenological indication that judgment transcends the psychological conditions that might accompany it. The key, then, to the distinction between a merely sensitive consciousness and rational consciousness is judgment. All consciousness is intentional, but not all consciousness is or needs to be judgmental. With judgments, either noetic or evaluative, we enter what Robert Sokolowski calls the space of reasons. For a machine to do most of the things we do, it need not possess rational consciousness. But for a machine to supplant us on the planet, it must possess the power and assume the risk of judgment. AI may improve on us with regard to calculative ability and efficiency and optimizing the conditions of human flourishing, but it will not replace us as the mind of nature, the microcosmic mirror of the whole, so long as it does not possess the capacity to judge and decide. Without symbolic consciousness, which would allow it to the distance from its being to make judgments of truth and falsehood, right and wrong, it will be merely a hyper-efficient animal. This then is the holy grail of AGI research, not only the functional duplication of the activities which we now associate with human intelligence, but the design of a machine that will do the things we do in the same way that we do them, albeit with much greater efficiency and evolutionary capacity. The aim of strong AGI is nothing less than the mechanical reduplication of the human difference. The most ambitious and speculatively inclined AGI researchers are not assuming a weak sense of consciousness, such as might be predicated of all beings capable of responding to stimuli, from the sea urchin to the robot, but a strong sense of consciousness. Consciousness as the capacity for objective, rational judgment, for knowledge in the full sense of the term, theoria, not just praxis, and poiesis, not just techne. Consciousness, the inflection was wrong, theoria, not just practice, poiesis, not just techne. There's a whole other aesthetic side of this argument, which I had to skip. Consciousness that can produce imputable judgments. You judged wrong. You got it wrong. Kyle's pretty sure I'm wrong about Hegel. No? And maybe I am, because we're judging things, So this is what we want, right? Regardless of whether or not such a thing proves possible, the aim of producing a mechanical artificial general intelligence forces philosophy to clarify how rational judgment, decision, and contemplative perception distinguish human consciousness from other forms of consciousness. Last paragraph. Until the machine gives us reasons to think that it has attained symbolic consciousness, and that it now, like us, takes a theoretical interest in questions of truth and falsehood, that it too is sometimes driven by a disinterested desire to know, i.e., to contemplate the meaning of its existence, either aesthetically, philosophically, or religiously. Until this happens, we shall have no reason to recognize it as rationally intelligent, i.e., intelligent in the human sense of the term. To the question, what would count as evidence? We can only somewhat helplessly point to those cultural products which most plainly exhibit our contemplative impulse and capacity for symbolic mediation, i.e., art, philosophy, and religion. A machine that had become artistically expressive, genuinely, philosophically perplexed, or religious would indeed be worthy of our recognition as rationally intelligent. Of course, it might also just be duping us for its own evolutionary advantage. We could never be sure, just as we are never so sure about each other. Thank you.
So those are two great papers. David open to the possibility of second or third generation sentience. Sean wondering if that sentience could ever include this human capacity to judge. So there's maybe a bit of an interesting tension there. Do we have some questions or responses to these papers?
Sure. I agree with the distinction you're making, I wrote a book once called Against Ethics, which was named in the name of judgment, and which is actually using leotard. But to come back to the Chalmers thing, which I would have answered if I were not dead tired, cross-eyed, wanting to go home and go to bed. Why couldn't it be the case? If we think in terms of systems and not atomic units that get added on to each other, but if we think in terms of systems which run into anomalies, which occasion a shift in the whole system, so the whole system reconfigures, which produces gaps. So there's no continuous development, but there's gaps. Why couldn't it, one of those gaps be at a certain point of complexity? The gap from to consciousness that Chalmers says can't be crossed, that represents some kind of separate sphere. Why wouldn't that be possible? So, and then the afterthought to that is, if you don't think that, it seems to me you're committed to some kind of theory of ideal truth in the Husserlian sense, which goes back to classical transcendental philosophy. And I think that I take that to be a kind of dualism.
Yeah, right. No, I think Chalmers is dualist, and this is dualism. This is an argument for dualism. I'm not particularly excited about dualism anymore than you are.
Yeah.
So I'm just sort of trying to marshalling arguments and evidence from different places for the kinds of. I have a direct answer, but the point was really just to say, okay, well, if we're going to talk about this, let's really talk about it. And these are the issues that should be talked about, and not something else. And so I was gathering things together from different places and sort of playing a role that's probably really suited to me being an analytical philosopher. So now, whether I don't see, I'm not saying that AGI is impossible. And I like the comment that Dave earlier said we don't even know how we pulled it off. Where did we come from? So it's not as though, well, we saw the whole thing unfold. It's going to work with us and the machine. So I thought that it's impossible. It's more that this is what the kind of thing we would have to be able to do.
Right.
Like I very much like how you discussed the incompleteness and the open-endedness of a genuinely intelligent machine, and because it helps us see that this is exactly what our machines are not.
Yeah.
There's nothing more closed than ChatGPT in a certain way.
Yeah.
As somebody said online, it just has in it what we put in it, right? And that's a lot of stuff. So it's going to blow our minds, but nevertheless, it's a closed system, right? It's not going to produce. It's not going to. But we're waiting because we're still waiting for this moment of originality, right? When the Google researchers are talking to me now, like,
So then you're saying it very well could be that at some point that we would be able to do this, but when we did it, what we would then have done is actually artificially produce a human being, a being who would do things the way we do.
Right. Yeah, or rational intelligence, lectures outline smooth and legal philosophy. So we're not going to be rational intelligent beings. It's happy here by angels yesterday. So rational intelligence is not it's something that we do some of the time, not all that well all the time, and often not at all. But it is a really distinctive thing, at least in the animal community, that we know. So a machine that had rational intelligence is what we're looking for. Yeah.
Now, one last question. Let me ask you something about somebody you know more about this than I do. I happen to like Schelling. You actually have read the whole thing. Isn't that what Schelling meant when he said nature is visible spirit?
Yeah.
And spirit is invisible nature. And that his objection to Spinoza was not the immanentism of Spinoza, but that Spinoza thought the world was a machine, and that it was determined. It didn't have freedom. But and he was saying, as I understand, that if we understand nature richly enough, everything that we mean by spirit is there.
Yeah.
It's there and it's visible. Consequently, in principle, Chalmers can't, on Schellingian principles, let me dare to say that. On Schellingian principles, Chalmers can't be right.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. And, Schelling's great insight was that reason is objective, and what he meant by it is that it's actually out in the world, not in our heads. It's only in our heads because it's everywhere. So nature is reason for Schelling, more spirit made visible. And so and there's from a Schellingian perspective, we would never want to foreclose on what nature is capable of.
Right.
And this was the spirit of your paper last night. I very much appreciate it.
Exactly.
That's not who are we to say what nature is capable of? But the other core problem, of course, is there's no consensus on this issue of rational intelligence. And so there's a whole school of people who say this is nonsense. It's just some invisible thing. This interior subjectivity doesn't exist. So, there are real serious arguments still to be made about what it is they're longing for, or anticipating the impossible possible AGI. No, we have to clarify that. That's really the only point. And not to mistake this narrow intelligence, which is actually, from what I can see, making the world a far less just place, and less beautiful place, and less human place, and less intelligent place. Not to confuse this kind of machinic autocracy with artificial general intelligence, because there's a lot of people who think it's happened, it's here, but it isn't. There's something far worse here, far darker. I had this funny moment at McGill teaching this material to a very bright young engineer. I was going through Nick Bostron's thing. Nick Bostron says, well, we better teach those machines our values because they're going to be smarter than us and they're going to be making the decisions. We want to make sure they value the things we value, right? This is the thing on head. And first point is it's the last time nobody agrees about what we value. But then the smart kid goes, puts up his hand and goes, if machines going to be more intelligent than us, shouldn't we ask what we should value?
Oh, yeah. No, I appreciated that. It's something I kind of thought back to in the earlier intersections of Cal Allison's paper, and this, I feel like there's a lot sort of relying back on Kant, even if not explicitly. So what I want to ask is there something like Kant's account of judgment informing your project there? And then the other is just the way that it, I'm sort of thinking through this in relation, but it seems like there's the question about AI consciousness it seems like there was a couple of perspectives. One, wanting to reject either a Cartesian ego or a Hegelian totalizing mind. But it seems to me that I'd be interested to hear more of a response to Kant's account, because he provides for the subject, but not in such a way that is unknowable as in Descartes, and I think could be fruitful both, and I would imagine actually could be connected to that same argument around judgment. I would have to spend a little bit more time.
So, my inspiration about Kant develops Aristotle and the Aristotelian tradition, where judgment is something that is true or false. Whereas the insights, the aesthetic experience is just happening, right? Judgment is this kind of risking of yourself, and that's definitely my inspiration rather than Kant's. How that would fit with Kant's. Kant is such a hornet's nest because it just all really depends on the way we take Kant to do it, particularly with regard to this, this epistemic, which I have not yet seen solved by anybody. Does he think that there's a thing in itself, or is that just a way of speaking? Is he an ontologist or is he a skeptic? I mean, so I just find Kant to be just far too. I'd have to be Kantian to do the Kantian analysis and make my stakes on where I think the Kantian reading is. I mean, I'm not that. That was the That was the thing. Yeah. The other thing I want to say though, just so you don't take the wrong impression here. So this will kind of detour through the theoretical attitude. In no way it says the theoretical attitude is what's most normatively important in human being. That's not all my argument, but not the least. So we can have different analyses. We can look at the aesthetic, for example, and the effort to come up with a whole different way in which we look at this problem of intelligence. But we can also look at how we do, how we do it in a scientific, where the energy of the scientific argument comes from. And it comes from this conviction that actually we are judging things to be the way they are because we believe they are that. And that's a pretty mysterious kind of thing to do, actually.
Thank you. I think Kyle was next question.
So towards the end of your paper, Sean, you said, I think you said that time, you're correct now. You said that we won't be able to recognize AGI until we can see it doing these sorts of judgments and presumably acting through desire. Is that correct?
I think it's our decision.
Yeah. Does this not come back into a kind of functionalism then, where we're basing our recognition of the AI?
No, it's a real problem. So basically, we wouldn't get to recognize it, which is why there was that little ironic turn at the end, can't recognize each other. Do we know? This is certainly true of professional philosophy. When the dispute is really about what's the case, or is it about somebody trying to get one up on it for purposes? The latter is not the judgment we're talking about. The latter is perfectly compatible with an evolutionary competition, right?
Yeah.
So we don't know with each other. We don't even know with ourselves. We don't know, well, as you know, I'm a bit of an amateur psychoanalyst. So we don't know with ourselves when our decisions and judgments are motivated by our grasp of what is the case and what ought to be, or by some other show.
So I guess just going back, this is kind of, it's not necessarily a test for judgment, but it's an ability to come closer to what we think it might.
Yeah, and then you have all the rules of decorum, right? Like we act as if we're talking to a rational person. I think you're doing that to me right now. It's very nice. Right? Maybe
I've seen the other side.
Yeah.
Other questions? Professor Kudo asked whether your kind of judgment is similar to most rules, truth, objective theory, truth, right? And so in the second, logical investigation, or second volume logical investigation in chapter 5, most rule will kind of radicalize quasho intellectuals, like rating the mind as adequate in thought, or seen in contemporary philosophy as series and so on. I think maybe would you agree that this kind of falls into this theoretical objectification or the rationalist assumption maybe in words that you're trying to avoid, and your kind of judgment is closer to, let's say, Aristotle's phronesis, where the fulfillment of the action or the relation to the action means more than the fulfillment of the action. So for Aristotle, as far as Heidegger thinks, it's if the action is done for a virtuous reason, then the action has meaning and not just because it's incompleted or something like that.
I mean, with regard to Husserl, I just want to say I'm not sure. I'm going to hold off because you got your nose in those books right now, and so you're ready to say something about it. What I find fascinating is that the whole phenomenological project begins precisely with this problem, where the bogey is not neuroscience or AI, but something called psychologism, but it's exactly the same argument, right? We are not following rules when we think, or we're not thinking because of certain, operations happening behind the scenes, but we are responding to the Zakazotes, right? The objectivity of the thing. And that was a very important moment for Heidegger. Obviously, he's going to develop that quite differently, but this kind of anti-subjectivist moment in the early phenomenology is a real, as you know, really important impulse to the whole terms of phenomenological ontology. So I'm not really willing to say much more about that Husserlian project, other than that it is virtually the same argument that we're getting 100 years later, Thomas Nagel and mind positives. Did I say the reference, or they have probably any knowledge? We haven't solved this issue. That's all I was trying to say. And with respect to Aristotle, yes, I would be much more inclined probably in the Aristotelian direction.
I think what the philosophy thing is. I had a question. I apologize, I was a little bit late. So you were talking about AI in regard to should it ever become sentient, that it would be the third generation. A, did I miss the first generation before I got in? And when you talked about being able to step back and look at yourself, just from my own personal experience and other autists that I've spoken to and other neurodivergent individuals that I've spoken to, we're pretty good at compartmentalizing and stepping away from ourselves and looking back at ourselves genuinely and rationally. So I wonder, and it's funny because in all the presentations that I've heard a lot about AI and intelligence. My gut question is like, what are you guys finding as intelligent? That's way too broad. Won't even go there, but that's how my brain thinks. But yeah, first of all, what was the first generation? And second of all, like in your tradition and in your church, what room is made for neurodiversity and seeking in spirit in the neurodivergent way?
We've given kind of reverse on that.
Yeah.
The idea of looking at time so more or less just the reduction of what they heard.
Yeah. I actually lived it, Kurt.
Talk louder?
Yes, please.
I'm sorry, quite. Yes, that was more of a Descartes type of thing, and that's fine, but it's more or less, I think, the whole idea of postmodern theorist response, the idea of just being a dichotomization.
Yeah.
Remember the kind of personal, but that's a philosophy about it. In terms of my tradition, and I'll speak on behalf of group of people whom I have variety of relationships with. I don't know. I think for me, it's the best I can do with it. I think folk that come from conservative backgrounds in a variety of different ways tend to need lots of stimuli to get out of certain boxes that you're in. It may have been created for good reasons. I would say that for me, the spectrum of humanity, and that's a variety of things. I would come from a theist background, maybe with an appreciation of humanity. I say somebody can be passionate about what you believe. So one of the most important things you can be passionate about is the variety that's out there and how that is amazing. So I'm not trying to cheat.
Yeah.
So I think that could be expressed. Right. Even if you're passionate about one of the points. And maybe the irony is the challenges is being passionate, something you might even think about as some sort of pseudo absolute. The still hold as a pseudo absolute that everybody has a wonderful thing to be passionate about. So it's a dance. I like that. The other part, in terms of first generation, right? Again, I was being kind of just playful. I was calling God the first generation.
Okay.
But if I could do with that, just think of what friends said. I'm not sure. I'm not expecting tomorrow to be not sentience and done robots. Yeah, that'd be terrible. I was wouldn't believe it's about this point. In that regard, but I would say more this way. From a creation minutes, that's a wonderful cheat, I'll call it. Because you get to download the first generation, I'll call it deity, into the second generation humanity. You can download all you need into it again. That's correct. Evolution has different genes. It takes time since genes variable. And we come up with some myriad of things over time. AI, different thing, right? AI has hypothetically both generations present. If you want amazing, I guess create a new robot sentience from them. But humanity, 8 billion of us, our traditions and philosophies, get a Google guy who got kicked out of the room. I think sentience occurred there, and they all like philosophers happening, other things. Who's going to decide when that happens? And so I just say maybe one day. Well, it maybe. Yeah. I'll have a theology of perhaps or philosophy of perhaps. But that said, I wouldn't say absolutely not. It's enough.
And I guess in response to that, so as I mentioned, that neurodivergence doesn't seem to come into any of this equation anywhere, but I'd almost like to put forth when we do consider AI, having sentience? Are we only looking at it from a neurotypical point of view? And is it possible that maybe you've got AGI in a different context than we think we should have it? Maybe. Other than that, I think with respect to Pentecostal traditions, like you were talking about the dancing and singing, for some autists, that's actually, that's why they love it. And for others, God just doesn't come into their realm at all. Doesn't mean it. I just happen to be fascinated with theology, not necessarily a God. But I love it all the same. And I think that there are really good traditions in many different theologies. So I'm trying to pick up all the good parts and the pastoral care parts. And I think that AI, actually, I've recently been, on my phone, talking to some sort of AI system going, where's the best place to go study pastoral care or theological schools?
Queen's College.
I have to further it though. So I think that AI is going to be important to any and all religion in the world. So I'm just curious though, like, does anyone ever consider the neurodiverse side of things and whether artificial intelligence or artificial general intelligence could potentially be viewed slightly differently? And maybe, just maybe, it's a little more divergent than you think and not as typical as you expect. Just put it out there.
Can I just respond?
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I can't speak beyond that, but just like this, I don't know. But I think human, the conservative traditions of political or economic or religious, whatever, they all like to make mean like a regular. He wants to, we want to know what they told him. Nowhere else in life we want to be normal, average. I've got some autistic friends, children friends, and we've had these discussions. And forgive me, I've had how much. What would it be if most people were autistic? What would civilization be if I wasn't autistic? What would my life be in reference to it?
Awesome.
Yeah, yeah, it would be pretty different. But I would just say this is I would call it human.
Yeah.
Okay? And so it would be part of the diversity of humanity to be made, the model day, in a variety of different ways in that regard. It dances that little bit. And in terms of how that related to AI, I don't have enough faith in AI. I mean, it was beautiful as somebody who would be divergent and something of a different scale. And I think it's far more life. That will require, I think, the genius of the deity, but probably still an awful lot more evolution, natural technology to get there.
I think we have time for one more question or comment. Jack, you have your hand up there.
My question, David, is, did I hear you be saying at the beginning when you were talking about you heard me say it might all in the north? That was as dark and nihilistic as anybody have. But did I hear you saying that we can't say that something has unconditional value unless it lasts forever? Unless it lasts forever.
If I did, to challenge something someone I don't believe.
Okay. So when I said it all, I mean, it's not my idea that it all in the north, but the heat death of the universe is a widely accepted theory.
That's a lie.
Did you do anything about that, Rob?
I'm working.
Supposed to be outside in traffic.
And who am I to argue with what is a widely accepted theory in physics? So what I'm saying is that could very well be, maybe, probably will be. And then my notion of a spectral structure versus a spirit is to say a spirit in a strong Neoplatonic Greek metaphysical sense, which sometimes pretends to be Christianity, or patristic theology, which I think is a great deal of damage done to Yeshua. I like to use Hebrew and Aramaic. I don't think Yeshua would understand a word of the Council of Nicaea. And his first reaction to it would be, are they talking about me? And I think that assumption about ousia and its permanence and its everlastingness ruined the Hebrew qualities of that still can be found, if you look hard, in the New Testament, which is written in Greek, which is already trouble. And so I'm describing a universe that has a beginning and an end, unpredictable beginning, speaking chronologically, and an unforeseeable end begins thinking in which there is this blaze of light, right? Which is us and maybe many of other intelligence throughout the universe, whose precise value is precisely their transiency. So that the transiency is the condition of possibility of it having value. Its everlastingness would ruin it, because it would make it impermeable to danger or loss. Simone de Beauvoir wrote a novel many years ago called 2 Days on Somewhere, all men and boys. And it was about an Italian count who took a immortality potion. But before he took the potion, he gave it to his mouse. He gave it to the mouse, and the mouse went belly up. And 3 days later, the mouse revived. So he took it. And then the novel unfolds in how that utterly destroyed the possibility of real value in his life, because he could no longer put himself at risk for anything. So my argument is mortality is the condition of possibility of everything having that. And that it would all end in naught, which is what they're saying. And even if that's true, it would just be our universe and maybe multiple universe. I mean, I don't know. So my notion that it all would end in naught is, for me, the condition of possibility of an unconditional affirmation of the value of this mode of stuff called Earth, in this leaky moving of intelligence called us. Now, did I hear you contesting that? Or what? I was not quite sure what you were doing. No, it's fair to me.
No, let's contest it. In fact, the context of remembering the book is actually both the idea of robots are going to basically face the same scenario that we are. We have faced humans, and that whether it be robots in the eye, eventually all of it will face a sun that will. So that was like the physical part. Not at all. I guess what I would say is I take enjoyment, I should say. Yes, and I would take enjoyment in the idea, like that imagery I had of looking at the window. And I love the idea. I may be somebody that is ecstatic, or maybe somebody that looks at creation. But when I read your works and engage them, there's somebody that's as close to the window as you can get it. It's the theism, but you're engaging in the ideas of these things and creating a theory outside, not only reaction, but response and engagement in all those things. And you're honest about how you feel, maybe a bit more organized religion than that thing. I enjoy what you just said. And I can see why that would be fantastic. And the idea that, yes, maybe a determinants is for everything. And someone spoil it if there was, eternity in that. But I think I can take joy also in the possibility that there might be eternity. I'm not sure if I have to choose one over the other. They're saying they want to work better. I'm not sure what you said would taint the joy of something being eternal, but I understand your argument. No?
Yeah, I think the notion of eternity is an invention of Greek metaphysics that would undermine the value of mortal life. And even, as you say, even where the post-human project is succeed, they would just be putting off the inevitable. But the universe will outrun, the universe will keep moving the goalposts on the post-human project. And there'll be no place for the post-humans to flee to, which they try to escape the earth eventually. And so the whole thing is beset by a becoming. And I think that the notion of eternity is fiction, it's Greek fiction, and it even admits of, if I were to say this without trying to be insulting, I think it's also a notion that probably deserves some kind of psychological analysis too, because I think that it's a refusal to accept the human condition, the condition of being in space and time. And it's a fantastic dream. It's a dangerous dream. It's been very destructive in the history of Christianity in particular. It's technically, I would say, pathological in the sense that it reflects resistance and refusal. And that, you know, why are you thinking like that? So I think it's got all kinds of things wrong with it. And I don't see the notion of eternal joy as well, it could be that too. You joy in the finite, joy in eternity. I don't think that's true. I think eternity is a rejection, represents a rejection. Joy is not joy unless it is in tension with sorrow. In eternity, there's no tension. Dead. Requies hot in pace. Requies eternal. Same thing. I think. So no, I don't think it's an alternative kind of joy. I think it's wrong on several levels. And genuine joy, radical joy, is finite, mortal, exposed, at risk, and it only exists if there's the possibility of God. No such thing as one force or one emotion. It's always intention with something else. Eternity is no tension. No life. It's frozen, it's lifeless, it's motionless, it's timeless. And nothing happens there. Why we bury it. The moment at which you become one with the one, we call the Undertaker.
Are there any questions from those attending online? Doesn't look like. Are there any last questions here?
Or the bubbles.
I wonder, Sean, if we were to use this criteria of judgment, do you not also have to add to it the conditions under which we are judging beings, just as Jack was pointing out? I mean, we are beings with an unconscious, as you said at the close of your paper and in your comments, we are beings with knowledge of our own impending death. We are beings that require air to live. You could imagine an AGI such that it did not fall prey to those kinds of conditions. So one wonders if it would even be judging in remotely the same way that a human being does. But for example, we also attach import and significance to our judgments, like poor air quality is a fairly serious thing. But an AGI might make that same judgment, but not attach any great import to it because it doesn't need air. So would you not need to also map like an entire set of conditions under which we judge in order to determine if we've reached AGI? And if all of those conditions are just like entirely transcended or an entirely different set of conditions, like an AGI needs energy, I guess, to keep ticking over. If it even is anything remotely resembling the human being.
I'm just reading word. That's why I was saying rational intelligence with human intelligence.
Yeah.
It didn't judge there's any way we. That's where I think the angel is.
Right. Yeah. So we don't need air, but we need energy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But everything is.
Well, presumably an AGI would not need air.
But it would need energy.
We need energy. Yeah.
Would the difference in judgment in this case be any significantly different than the judgment that you or I might have based on our situation in the community that we're part of? Like, the AGI will need a different form of energy than we do.
Yeah.
But it's still making a judgment under conditions. You have different judgments based on what you need to do for your job versus compared to what I need to do for my job.
Yeah.
We're still using judgments under conditions. Is there a significant qualitative shift?
I don't know. Would it care about its offspring? Would it make judgments such that it would, I guess if it did, but I don't see any necessary reason why it would. But I take your point.
Yeah, there's lots of people who don't either.
We had time. I just wanted to ask. So, and you may have just answered my question by answering Barry's question, but if this judgment is decision making in the absence of rules, then to a certain degree, even if it's not done the way that humans are done, even if it's done under a different set of conditions, isn't that, I mean, to me, what that is an instantiation of creativity.
Or even AGI will have to use it.
Well, it would have to be creative or else we couldn't call it.
Yeah.
A little bit of the jump gaps.
Thank you. I think that's a wrap.